want to spend a few minutes and talk about the actual mechanics or what's actually going on when one is having a pastoral conversation in a jail setting, or at least what my experience has been. It's something that I've asked a lot about, I've read a lot about, and I've noticed that it's kind of elusive, like what is actually going on. I mean, at a basic level, if you were to walk past me talking to an inmate in the jail, just very plainly, and someone were to ask you what's going on here, at its basic level, what's happening is I am talking with an inmate, and we're having a conversation. On that level, it's quite simple. But I'm finding there's a lot more going on than that, and there's been a lot written about what it is and how it happens and how we can help it to happen. And this all falls under, I guess, the broad umbrella of what can be understood as pastoral care. Just to kind of contrast this with other things that it could be that it's definitely not, there's a few things that come to mind that might be worth just cordoning off certain things that are outside of the scope. Now, of course, the number of things that this is not is innumerable, but I'll name a few that some people might think is part of pastoral care or part of doing ministry in a corrections environment. So in no particular order, I mean, one of them that it is not is it's not meant to be a theological debate. It's not as though you show up and you ask the inmate what his sort of philosophical or religious views are, and then you debate him on that and try to show him the errors of his own theology. So it's not that. Nor is it an attempt to convert an inmate to a particular way of thinking. Now, with that in mind, I don't hide the fact that, I'm a Christian and I tend to see spiritual things through a Christian lens. I don't deny that, and sometimes that even comes up in conversation. But it's not as though I am there specifically to try to, make disciples exactly. Now, I happen to believe that the Christian faith is, the closest thing I know to getting at the ultimate reality. So my sense is, if I'm leading someone toward truth, or if I'm encouraging them to try to figure out what the underlying truth of the universe is, that inevitably, if they earnestly seek that out, I believe they will find Jesus. They will find something that closely resonates with what might be considered the traditional Christian faith. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but it's not meant specifically to convert someone, nor is it meant to be psychiatry, nor I'll just leave it at that. I'm not providing, medical treatment, nor am I trying to fix someone. That whole model of someone being broken and I show up with things that they need, that's not the approach I take, and nor is it an approach that one ought to take, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of most contemporary writers on pastoral care. So I'm going to share a couple things that I think sort of describe what's going on. I mean, it is definitely a spiritual conversation, and I'll perhaps talk more about that. I have spoken about that. There's one reference point that I find helpful, and it comes from a book that I read called, I think it's called just Pastoral Care. It's by Karen Scheib. I can't remember the subtitle of the book, but she talks about how we are creatures that are wired for story, that we are wired for narrative, that there's something about our being that makes us resonate with story, and that we have our own stories to tell, and in some cases our own stories to rewrite. And I don't have this at my fingertips, but she talks about being a companion, a story companion. Now, I have to admit, like, some of the literature on pastoral care, and perhaps some of the reason I've been a little bit hesitant to get into it in the past, is it can come across as a little new agey, a little woo-woo, a little ephemeral, like hard to sort of pin down. There's lots of concepts and models and things, and it can become quickly not very concrete. So that's why I began this by talking about, at its core, what we're talking about is a conversation. But a conversation has a lot going on in it. Anyway, she talks a lot about how we tend to see the world in and through stories, that we're constantly telling ourselves stories, we're constantly telling one another stories, that's how we impart, real or deep knowledge to one another. There's sort of a surface level knowledge, what might be considered like a technical knowledge or scientific knowledge, where we can talk about, a certain thing or a certain phenomenon in sort of technical or scientific terms, like sort of the facts, like, if I tell a story that, maybe I ran into someone, from years ago at the store, and I tell the story to my wife, and we met so-and-so. I mean, the technical details, like what store was I in, and what aisle was I in, and what was I wearing, and what was the other person wearing, like those details, like they're facts, I guess, but often those types of things are left out of the story unless it's germane to what we're talking about. It's more about the emotion that, hey, here's someone from our past, I ran into them, here's what we talked about, here are other people that they brought up. Those are sort of the things that are important to that kind of story. So anyway, that's sort of the frame that she suggests, and I found myself doing it, I think, before I started reading her book. But after reading her book, it kind of gave me a story to kind of help me understand what was happening. And I think it helped me get unstuck in some conversations. That's something that happened early on, as I found, in general, I would more frequently be getting stuck in conversations. And as I've done it, I still get stuck at times, but the conversations tend to, over time, become deeper, longer, more spiritual in nature. I find I don't get stuck as often. And using this frame of a story can certainly help. And what I'm realizing is, I think we all, at our core, are storytellers, but not all of us have, I guess, story literacy, if that makes sense. So I found with many of these inmates, they have a story, but they have trouble telling it. And often my role is to kind of help them tell their own story by, they start with something that's pretty basic, and I sort of reflect back or ask something about it. I might even use a phrase, and then they can either accept that and incorporate it into that story or not. I don't know, so an example might be, they're telling me about something that happened, and I'm noticing that they're kind of agitated, and I might offer, and that's the way you sort of see it. I'm not telling them what is, but sort of offering, an explanation, or offering them a little story fragment and saying something like, you sound frustrated by that. And then they might say, like, yes, I'm really frustrated. Or they might say, you know what, I don't know if it's frustration as much as it's anger, or it's not frustration as more as confusion. Or you kind of give them something, and then it's up to them to sort of take it, change it, reject it, and you sort of continually reiterate these things. Where if you can sort of mirror their emotions, or give them words to it, I guess, it sounds like you feel betrayed, maybe. Yes, it's betrayal, that's what I'm feeling. And so then they can use those words, and they can tell a more complex story, but they have greater facility to articulate a story to themselves. And it's, on the one hand, it's actually quite basic, and on the other hand, it's quite profound to see that work. There was one fellow, again, I won't talk about specifics, but there have been inmates who, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's mental health, or probably most of the times it's for reasons I don't fully understand, but they're just not really able or willing to communicate on some level. And it happened with one fellow, and I can't remember if he was sort of speaking words, but very softly. I'm not sure if they made sense, if they were quite coherent. I don't think it was a language problem. I think he seemed to understand me. And some of the questions I tend to ask at first are like some variant of, how are you doing? How are you coping? How are you managing? Like, what's going on? Those sorts of questions. And also kind of reading, like, do you want to talk? Sometimes they'll stay on their bunk, and I'll sort of say, like, did you want to spend a few minutes chatting, or would you prefer I left you to your books or something like that? And so I'm trying to seek permission or gauge whether they actually want to talk. But anyway, this fellow, he came toward the door, sort of muttering things, but it's like he couldn't quite engage in the conversation. And I said something like, I'm sensing that you want to talk because I noticed you've come to the door. Like, am I right about that? Is that? And he sort of nodded, or he gave me some sort of affirmation. And again, I can't remember the details, but we didn't really have a conversation exactly, but somehow me picking up that he actually kind of wanted to interact with me on some level, that I noticed by his actions that he moved toward the door and that he was nodding, and I was sort of giving him stuff that he could, again, I can't remember if this is the particular thing, but it's something along the lines of, I'm sensing that you want to talk, but maybe you don't know what to talk about, or you're not sure if you really want to share things with me, or something to that effect. And he kind of nodded. So I was giving him these things, and he was, taking them or not taking them as he saw fit. And again, that particular conversation on many levels was not a very good conversation. Like, was there a lot of intellectual connection there? I don't think so, really. But I think there was something kind of deeper that happened, that we made some kind of connection there. So that idea of story, I think, is helpful to sort of view the world, I guess, or view other people. And it leads nicely to the future, because you can start asking, what's, as you write the next chapter in your life, like, what's that chapter going to be about? Like, what are some of the things that you've learned or that are learning that's going to help you write the next chapter? So it kind of encourages people to think about, where they are, where they've been, for good and for bad, and sort of what's shaped them, and then turning their mind to, like, well, what's next? Like, if things go really well, what would that look like? And you can even phrase it in the negative, like, if things were to, like, if you are going to get derailed by something, knowing what you know about you, what are the kinds of things that might derail you in the next chapter? And it's interesting, I think at the one hand I was afraid to talk about negative things, fearing that it would, things are already negative enough. But I've also noticed that people seem to appreciate the acknowledgement that some things in their lives are pretty crappy. And again, I think one has to use discernment about, not dwelling too much on the negative, but also not denying it. And one thing that I found really helpful, and I can't remember where I picked this up, something I read, but it's also a fairly basic thing, especially from a Christian point of view, and that is reading Psalms with inmates is, in my experience, tremendously powerful. I have to admit, I'm by no means an expert on the Psalms. I've read through them probably a few times in my life. I found, I think I've done that, I'm not sure when this dawned on me, but I think that I mentally edit many of the Psalms. Again, like, the Psalms are ancient Hebrew poetry or songs, many of them set to music, but they were liturgical, that these would be poems that would be read. And frankly, many of them, on first glance seem to oppose or don't fit with sort of the Christian ethic or view of God. Like, some of them are pretty raw, like where they get angry with God, or they get angry with their enemies, or they seem to be kind of harboring bitterness, or even that kind of thing. So it sort of dawned on me that I mentally tend to edit many of the Psalms, but there they are in our Bible. And it's amazing how showing up to talk to an inmate and then reading them certain psalms. And I'm actually reading through them now with a mind for what kind of thing might resonate well with an inmate. And what's strange is, I mean, there's many different psalms, but two fairly prominent genres are like psalms of lament and psalms of praise. So the laments are like where are you, God? Why have you forsaken me? My enemies surround me. I've been despised. I've been cast aside. How long, O Lord, do we have to wait for you? We seem forgotten. You've turned your back on us, or so it seems. That kind of thing, like that sort of anguish. Psalm 88 is a particularly dark psalm. So that's one that I've used. And then, of course, there's these there's other genres that are more praiseworthy to God. And somewhat surprisingly, I find that the Psalms of Lament, well, maybe it's not surprising, but showing up to an inmate cell, someone who's in despair, who's hurting, with a, cheer up, old chap, things will get better soon, doesn't, not that I've really done that exactly, but that maybe doesn't resonate. But when you can read a scripture that puts words or puts a story, to come back to Karen Scheib, that puts sort of a narrative to their feelings, that can be really powerful. It's amazing just how quickly reading Psalms with an inmate can, be very emotional, like very quickly, in a good way. I think what's happening, I mean, there's probably all kinds of things happening, is that it can give them permission to, what's the word? It maybe reassures them that they can have these bitter feelings and that those feelings don't cut them off from God, something like that. I think sometimes there's all kinds of ways Christianity can go wrong. Now, I believe that in general, when you live your life in a way that's in accordance to God and His ways and His teachings, that's a good way to live your life. Now, it doesn't mean that materially good things will happen to you, though sometimes it will. But living your life in a way that's resonant with the Creator, brings certain rewards just because you're in tune with the Creator and His ways. And sometimes I think Christians, especially ones that are well in tune with God and they seem to live good lives, and that can be a real testimony to people, don't get me wrong. But it can also, for people who aren't Christians, it can be confusing because they see someone who's living a good life, who is honest and respectable, and their children are well behaved, and they're doing well in their career, and they're well regarded in the community, and they happen to be Christian. People can kind of confuse the cause and effect, I guess, where someone can say, oh, I see that person over there, he seems to have everything together. Christianity must be for people like him who have their life together. Like, why not accept God when things are going well? And they sort of confuse that's actually what you're witnessing is more the effect, not the cause. So some of these psalms of lament, I think, can just help, well, all of us, frankly, but maybe especially inmates or people who are in desperate situations, put words to their pain and understand that even despite that pain, that God is still there, God is still listening. There's a pattern in the Psalms. Not everyone follows it exactly. And Psalm 88 is certainly one that does not follow this pattern. Again, I'm no expert in the Psalms. But in general, especially the Psalms of Lament, they tend to start off like, where are you, God? Why have you forsaken us? Why do you not hear my cry? Why do you let my enemies win? And then there's sort of a transition where it's, but I'll praise your name, but you'll be exalted, and the righteous will find the reward. That there's this sort of like, we're in anguish, but we're still going to praise you. There's often that sort of transition that the Psalms of Lament tend to end on something that kind of says, if you can boil it all down, actually going a little bit far afield here, but it's a little bit like, many of them follow a similar arc to the book of Ecclesiastes, which, in my opinion, is a pretty downcast book. The way I might sum it up is the writer of Ecclesiastes basically tries all these things. He tries fame, he tries pleasure, he tries power, and it all just comes up short. And it seems like at the end he kind of shrugs and says, well, none of this is any good, and I guess the only thing that has like a hope is like maybe follow this God, I don't know. But even that, it's not very emphatic. It's like, these other ways are definitely not the way, and this other way is kind of like, following God, yeah, I guess it couldn't hurt. It is sort of the way it comes across anyway. And sort of the Psalms are like that kind of say, things are messed up, things are broken, but still, despite all that, we are going to choose to believe that somehow there is a God who's in charge of all this brokenness, and ultimately there's a God who's going to redeem us. And if we have any hope, it's going to be this God that's going to lead us through this difficult time. So that's a little bit about what goes on, I guess, spiritually, or sort of how these conversations are conducted. And it is still a strange thing, even as I do it, having these, like thinking about narrative. I won't get into it, but there's Carl Rogers talks about a client-centered approach, which isn't, it's more psychology than theology exactly, but the idea of sort of putting the person you're talking to kind of in the center and kind of, sort of putting them in charge, like seeing yourself as a helper or a guide, or actually not even a guide, a companion, to use Scheib's word, I think. Someone who walks alongside and maybe helps someone make sense of what they're going through. Maybe I'll leave it there. I thought I had one other thing that came to mind. It's a conversation, and I think I was searching for kind of formulas, maybe on some subconscious level, like, well, when they say this kind of thing, then you say that kind of thing. And if they bring up X, you talk about W, and you kind of, and that's not how it works. It's sort of strange. It's, one has to be attentive, one has to be paying attention, but also one cannot, if you're trying to steer the conversation, like, that doesn't work. You have to kind of pay close attention, but somehow hold the conversation loosely, and hold the goals loosely even. There's something about, if you try to force something, it doesn't work. And if you're too hands off, that also doesn't work. There's sort of this Goldilocks part in the middle where you need to be present, you need to be engaged, but you can't try to force something that's not going to happen. It's strange, and again, some of these terms get kind of esoteric and not very concrete, but I realize that when these conversations happen well, that I get a sense, I hesitate to use this term, but I'll use it anyway. It's a little bit like an out-of-body experience. Now, I don't mean that quite literally, but it's something like that, where I feel like I'm not doing so much as I'm witnessing, like I'm observing something that's happening, as opposed to, and I'm participating in it, but I'm not providing the motive energy in this somehow, that, something else, someone else is doing that it's more, bearing witness to something. Again, this language, I am a little bit uncomfortable with it, but I don't know a better way to describe it, that they're sort of bearing witness to something kind of unfold in front of you and also participating in it, but not doing it or creating it or causing it, strictly speaking. You're enabling or encouraging or creating the right conditions for something to happen. That's kind of what it's like. I'm not sure if this is a good analogy. Like, a farmer plants a seed, and a good farmer can do things to create the right conditions. He can make sure the soil is moist but not too wet. He can make sure that weeds are kept at bay. He can, keep pests away from it. But he doesn't cause the sun to come up. He doesn't even like what's happening in the seed itself, like all that microchemistry and stuff, whatever genetics going on in a seed, I don't know. He doesn't actively cause that. That is inherent in the seed. He's creating conditions, and the seed and nature and God is doing the ultimate work. It's something like that. You're creating conditions and then kind of stepping aside and observing something unfold before your eyes. And it's profound.